Hey, I want to talk to you a minute. I want to readdress something. I want to go back to Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov. I just wanted to introduce you to that sort of learning, classical conditioning. And now I want to kind of give you the nuts and bolts of that. And this is a little bit complicated because there's a lot of terminology. I'll walk you through it, but I think you need to be exposed to this because it's a whole lot different than operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is voluntary behavior. It's based on the consequences of the behaviors you choose when you're in a particular situation. So I either want to do A, B, C, or D, whatever the behavior is, and then I deal with the consequences, and then that's either going to cause me to want to do that behavior again, or it's going to cause me not to want to do it again, and then there are a lot of variables with that. But it's basically voluntary. It's something I choose to do. It's not the case in classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is involuntary. It's based on repetitive introduction of a stimulus to produce an association. Let me say it again. It's a repetitive introduction of stimulus to produce an association. So you keep being exposed to something, and eventually, depending on your reasoning level, whether you're a dog or a person or whatever the case is, you you begin to make an association. Now, here comes the terminology, and it's a little bit confusing. Let me remind you that the word conditioning means learning. So classical conditioning, that's what we're talking about here. First learning or basic learning or anything in that genre. So away we go with the terminology. Let's begin with what's known as a neutral a neutral stimulus. It's a stimulus that does not naturally bring about a response of interest. So let's look at Pavlov's dogs. What would be a neutral stimulus? I'm having a hard time with that word this morning. Neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus in the case of his dogs would be the lab assistant. Why? Because there's nothing in a dog's mind that would indicate that seeing a lab assistant means food. So it's a neutral stimulus. Doesn't have any importance in the dog's eyes. And we're using the dogs because that's what Ivan Pavlov used or was using when they accidentally discovered this classical conditioning, this association business. So neutral stimulus. Man comes into the lab assistant, white coat, whatever, and the dogs really don't take any notice. They're hooked up to a machine that's measuring how much saliva they excrete. Now, what happens? The lab assistant feeds them. Same guy. Let's call him Charlie. Charlie comes into the lab. He's never fed them before. They see Charlie. They don't think anything about Charlie. There's another human being. Whoopie-doo. But something happens. Charlie feeds them. So that's pretty cool. Thank you, Charlie. Now, the next day, Charlie comes in. What does Charlie do? Feeds him again. Now they're beginning to take notice. What they're doing is they're forming what's called an unconditioned stimulus. What does unconditioned mean? Unlearned. So they're beginning the process of making a connection to Charlie and food. So he has now graduated from neutral stimulus to unconditioned stimulus. He's coming in to feed them. They then progress to an unconditioned response. Now, this still includes Charlie. Charlie is still bringing them the food. But an unconditioned response is their salivation in anticipation of being fed by Charlie. That's called an unconditioned response, an unlearned response. It's an unlearned reaction to an unconditioned stimulus. Hope you're following me. Charlie's the lab assistant. Charlie comes into the room day one. No biggie, no connection. Day two, he comes in, he feeds them. Oh, Charlie takes on some significance. Now, this continues. Couple, 3 days. Now they are learning that Charlie is the source of food. And they begin to respond to that. It's called unlearned at this point. What happens? This continues so that it becomes a conditioned stimulus. That means a learned stimulus. Now they see Charlie and they immediately know that Charlie's going to feed them. So what is their response? They salivate. This now becomes a learned response, a conditioned response, a learned reaction to a conditioned stimulus that occurs after repeated pairings with an unconditioned stimulus. What does that mean? I'll tell you, I've already told you, it's very simple. Charlie comes in day one, no feeding. Charlie comes in day two, he feeds them. Day three, feeds them again. Now they're beginning to respond to Charlie. Comes in day four, day five, day six. There's no particular number associated with the number of visits that Charlie has to make to feed them. It depends on the individual dog. Probably some dogs pretty quickly picked up on Charlie being the feeder. They probably were the smarter dogs. The dogs that weren't as smart probably took longer. Maybe it took them 4 or 5 days, and the smarter dogs 2 or 3 days. It doesn't matter. What matters is they learned. So they went from neutral stimulus to unlearned or unconditioned stimulus, and that associated with unconditioned response. They still haven't totally learned it yet. Eventually, over a period of time, with repetition, with Charlie continuing to come into the lab and feed them, now they learn, here's Charlie, he's the guy with the food. So he becomes a conditioned, a learned stimulus, excuse me, and their response to that is a learned response. They have learned who Charlie is in terms of him being the bearer of the food. Hope that makes sense. They don't try to learn that. I'm sorry. They don't try to learn it. It happens. Now, could they ignore him? Well, yes, but you're not going to really have that happen with forms of life that aren't human. We are reasoning things. We may ignore Charlie. If he was coming in to feed us, but depending on what our situation was, let's say you're in the hospital, you're incapacitated. And the first day you're in there, this nurse comes in and feeds you. How long is it going to take you to learn after she comes the second time? How long is it going to take you to learn that she's the one who brings the food? Probably right away. After a couple of times, boom, because we're human beings, we can reason. Or you may not pay attention to it, whatever your situation is. So there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on with this, but primarily those are the basics. We don't, we can graduate from this to operant conditioning. An animal probably wouldn't. Primates probably would, depending on the primate. There's some animals out there that reason. Not at the level that we do, but some that do nonetheless. So that's kind of the gist of it. You in operant conditioning, you voluntarily choose to pursue a behavior. In classical conditioning, you form an association with something. I'm trying to think of another example that packages. Well, I hope you got it. I don't want to make it too complicated for you. So there are your terms. Neutral stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. It's just a graduating process till you get to the learning. Okay, so enjoy that. I hope you did. Hope it clarifies any questions you had, and I'll visit you again soon.